So you do have the Seahawks taking Jalen Carter. Why?
Yeah, so, I just went, look, I know what's being said. I also know that this is an organization that has taken some guys a little edge in the past. I think the difference is here you got to determine if there's some edge or if there's a maturity issue, if there's a fundamental issue with impulse control and character and things like that. And so, and how likely is that, how is that going to shape out? What does your locker room look like? What does your leadership workout look like? What does your coaching staff look like? Do you have the elements needed to work with a player like Jalen Carter? We've got enough knowledge now, even publicly, and they're going to know more privately, that Jalen Carter, you have to have a plan for him because he has some real maturity issues, but he's also incredibly talented from a football standpoint. It's a position of need, obviously, for Seattle. And so ultimately I said, okay, if I skip on this, I'm taking Jalen Carter with Detroit the next pick. I do think there's a scenario where Seattle trades back. Honestly, I don't think they're going after a quarterback this year. I think they'll wait until next year. But I decided to take the talent there and move forward because I think as the draft gets closer, I think one of the interesting things are some NFL GMs get a little passive and some get more aggressive. And I know that John Schneider trades back a lot, but I also think that he's a guy willing to be aggressive and willing to take shots with players that he believes can win games for him. And you have to know the player, though. And that's why it's important to bring Jalen Carter in and try to play poker with him and try to get a feel for him as a person as much as you can. So it's an integral part of the process. And so obviously you have to do your homework on him because he's really talented.
NFL Network's Lance Zierlein here with us. Matt Stinchcomb about a month ago came on our show, the old Georgia All-American. SEC does games down there and said, take Jalen Carter number one, do not even think about it. Matt Miller from ESPN last week came on our show and said his traits as a defensive tackle are as good as anybody in the last 10 years. When you actually pop on the tape, you look at the productivity, you look at the player, none of this stuff off the field, just strictly as a player. Do you think he is that level dominant?
I've got him as the highest rated player in this year's draft, but I think he's more Jeffrey Simmons, who I think is an excellent player. I think he has a chance to be a Pro Bowl player. Now, that level of dominant, I think he has the elements to become an outstanding interior defensive lineman who can not only rush, or can not only, stop the run, but also become a really good pass rusher. I will say this, though. There are times I look at him and I see Jonathan Allen, for example, which is certainly no slight, but it would make sense that Georgia players a lot of times look like Alabama players. They're just in different uniforms. Kirby Smart looks for the same type of players that Alabama has looked for years, and you see those elements with Jalen Carter. I do think that he's, I think he's a very good player. He's not as productive, and you're not going to be in that defense as some of the other players. But I think when you look at size, strength, quickness, the elements that you want to look for from disruptive interior players, the ability to play all three downs, yes, Jalen Carter has that. So if you take all the other stuff off the board, he is my top-rated player in this year's draft.
It's interesting. I think we've been talking about this sort of disaster scenario, quote unquote, where the first four picks in the draft are in some order: Bryce Young, C.J. Stroud, Will Anderson, and Anthony Richardson. And, I don't know whether that's a real situation or not, but, you have Richardson way down a lot farther and even below Will Levis. How come?
Well, I think one of the quarterbacks is going to slide. You just have to kind of take your guess which one it's going to be. To me, if Tyree Wilson were there, I wouldn't blink an eye. I would just Tyree Wilson, boom, done. He's a Seahawk. Let's go. And I move on to the next thing. Because Tyree Wilson, actually, I know three different teams right now who have Tyree Wilson ahead of Will Anderson.
Well, I'm sorry, hold on, just not to cut you off, but do you mean over Jalen Carter?
No.
Okay.
Over Will Anderson.
Wow.
Over Will Anderson. So I think that what's going to be surprising is that NFL teams may not look at Will Anderson with the same level of exultation as the rest of us do. It's also the thing where you wonder how much more you're going to get out of Alabama players. I mean, they're so well coached. Their physical training there, the training center that they have and the psychological stuff that they do. And they've just really advanced at Alabama, and they get a lot out of their players while they're in college. And so, one consideration you always have is Alabama players tend to come out with some nicks and bruises and a lot of times need surgeries. The other thing is some people believe they're as good as they're going to be in college, and so you're not going to see a lot of growth. And the exact opposite is true with Tyree Wilson, where a lot of people believe he has traits. He's bigger, he's explosive, and he's still got room to get a lot better from a technique standpoint. And look at the production he has right now. So I think Tyree Wilson, if he were to last there at 5, that's also obviously a position in need. You got 2 potentially outgoing edges with expiring contracts. Tyree Wilson, to me, would make a lot of sense, and he's got the traits that John Schneider really covets. So I think it's easier to get one at 5 if Tyree Wilson's there than to try to get that at 20.